was actually the individual who phrased the expression, the superpower of crime. He saw the fits and starts of trying to begin a budding democracy in the former Soviet Union, and as things ran off the track, and as things seemed to go from bad to worse, he used the phrase. So it's certainly one that was coined in Europe. The outline of what I'll talk about today is, and certainly I'll entertain questions as we talk. I don't want this to be a lecture per se. Is the Soviet model really set the stage, how it had evolved from the turn of the opening of the 20th century to almost the end of the 20th century, had a lot of fundamental influence on how people saw the world, how they saw the relationship with the government, how they saw their new role as kind of the skies opened up and the Soviet Union collapsed, and how they responded to that. At the same time, the perfect storm came about when you looked at as the Soviet Union collapsed, and the phrase transglobal technology enablers is a mouthful, but certain things took place globally, as Thomas Friedman and others talked about in The World is Flat, that enabled electronic crime from a distance to be viable and to be brutally effective. And the last bit we'll talk about is kind of how these organized crime groups have shaped their nature, how they view the world, and to the first point about an ecosystem, how they have aggregated some skills within what evolved out of the hacker culture into really systematic skill sets to write code, to execute money laundering, and to execute a credential collection or financial instrument collection. Okay, here we'll start with the history lesson. So if you talk about Russia, you have to have a picture of Karl Marx. So just right off the mark, we're okay. And again, I make this point, and it may seem rudimentary. You have Russia, which was a feudal state, despite Peter and others' efforts to kind of westernize Russia and that part of then to be the Soviet Union. It was still a very definite feudal state. If you look at Marx and Engels and the others who were characterizing Marxism and post-capitalism world, they were really looking at Western Europe. They were looking at Germany and Europe, and they were seeing the industrial age being developed, and they saw how people were being taken advantage of, the rich were getting richer, the poor were continuing to suffer. So as they looked at a model and they looked at where capitalism and then Marxism would come about, they weren't really looking at Russia. So you have the Russian Revolution begins, the Tsar's killed. Lenin's surprised in the sense that he had his eyes set on Russia and Eastern Europe, but they were really looking to things evolving out of Western Europe. But at the end of the day, it still was a very totalitarian organization. That's the model they knew. As I said, that's the model that they went to. Look at the economic and political examples. If you take the course of history, if you say 12 years as a generation, you have several generations that grew up in the Soviet model, with the expression each according to his ability, given each according to his need. So what was the incentive really to do more? We've seen many examples of that. The new economic policies, the NEP during Stalin's time, millions were killed. Stalin was famous for the quote, "The death of an individual is a tragedy. The death of a million is a statistic." So there's great directions that the economies went in that were not teaching people how to build businesses, how to cooperate to everyone's mutual benefit, and that this was not a viable economic model. Even the agrarian base, when you look at Russia and the Soviet Union expanded 11 time zones, the Urals, other areas that were highly productive or potentially highly productive in agriculture, and they had a hard time feeding themselves. Those of us who are old enough remember the wheat sales and how the U.S. used to track wheat growth, and the Soviet Union is an indicator of how effective their agrarian base was. It got so bad at one point the head of really the Soviet agrarian model was a fraud, basically, who's argued that wheat production could be increased and made more hardy by just putting the wheat kernels in a refrigerator for a couple of days and then planted. So his idea of genetics was a little rudimentary. But the point was, the system was broken, and it didn't have a lot to start from. To that point, there was no particular loyalty to the state. Anyone who grew up in the Soviet Union, it was a barter system. The old stories are, the word is out that red shoes are available in gum in the big department store. Everybody queued up to get shoes. You didn't need red shoes, but you got red shoes so that you could barter the next day for medical care or something else. So there was no participation in the state, and every man was looking out for himself. So that model prevailed as things unfold. Then we look at the perfect storm. 1990 comes about. You had some of the revolts in Latvia. You had Poland, and the shippers' union began to start to see some cracks in the armor, and where things were beginning to come unhinged. But basically, as the Soviet Union fell, the dust settles 92, 93, 94. You have the life expectancy actually drops. One of the rare occasions in a Western society, as I recall, it may have ticked back up a bit. I think it fell to 52 years old. So by that stat, I wouldn't be up here talking to you today. So a quarter of the population in abject poverty. And anyone who's wintered over in Moscow or Northern Europe or Siberia can appreciate the harshness of having to survive on little to nothing. And when I say humiliated and maltreated, humiliated in the sense of 89, the Soviet Union is still intact. They're still consider themselves in the world, considered them a superpower. The clock ticks around a year or two. The Soviet Union's collapsed. You have all the nationalism boiling up out of the former Eastern European countries. And the last thing they want to do is have anything to do with the Soviet Union and what it stood for. And everything it did was wrong. And so you had a superpower, and they're suddenly on the bottom of the heap, in a sense. And maltreated. There's still underlying resentment within Russia that during the 90s, when the West went into Russia to legitimately start business, to legitimately take advantage of the economic opportunities there, that somehow we pulled a fast one on them, that we undercut both the democratic process and undercut the economic development that was underway. And so when the house of cards in the 90s fell in Russia, there's still a good body of folks in Russia who think somehow there was some sinister plan to all that. I will argue that there wasn't, but nonetheless, perception is reality. So who was in charge as the Soviet Union collapsed and things get underway? The intelligence and state security services. Historically, whether it was the KGB's predecessor, the NKVD, or other permutations, they were always outward looking. They were the ones that were trained in foreign languages. They operated front companies. They touched the West and the rest of the world. And in many ways, they were kind of an entrepreneurial group. They were given an intelligence mission by whatever means they needed to do, and they went out and pursued that. So they were the ones that were always kind of ready when things collapsed to kind of fill in the void. And also, they were state security. They operated with much more impunity than the native Russian or Eastern European citizens. So they were an advantage. And the underground economy, as I alluded to earlier about if red shoes are available, everybody gets red shoes, and you trade and you barter. And there's always this underlying struggle to kind of get by, trade up for a bigger apartment, trade something for another advantage. So there was always this kind of attitude that we're going to have to kind of figure out a way to do this on our own. At the same time, there was certainly crime. It was plain vanilla crime, however you wanted to define it. And it had also been affected. If you could organize and effectively commit crimes in a police state, you've gotten to be pretty good at it. So it was kind of a highly evolved state of organized crime.